Thank you everyone for hopping on this afternoon. So today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about our project about identifying and analyzing implicit interactions in critical infrastructure systems. So as Randy mentioned, this is joint work that was conducted with John Villasenor of UCLA. So right off the top, I'll acknowledge that this work was done with CIRI support through their grants from the Department of Homeland Security. And I'll express the disclaimer that the views and conclusions in this document are those of myself and my colleagues, not necessarily representing any official policy expressed or implied of Department of Homeland Security. So now that we got that out of the way, when we say critical infrastructure, what kind of systems do we mean, right? So critical infrastructure refers to a number of different kinds of systems, some that you may be familiar with, some that you may not even think of as a critical infrastructure. So we're talking about systems like advanced manufacturing, chemical processing facilities, maritime ports and operations, wastewater treatment, communication networks, energy grids, all of these kinds of systems that really form a backbone of the nation's infrastructure and ability to be economically sound and to progress as a society. However, as many of us are well aware, these systems are not the most secure systems in the world, and they suffer from a number of critical issues. And there are a number of reasons for this, right? So there are a number of different cybersecurity challenges that critical infrastructure faces. And the first is that these systems are very ubiquitous and pervasive. They exist just about everywhere you look, which means that they are just prominent in our daily lives. These systems, they're large, they're complex, and they're rapidly growing. The more and more we look around, the more and more cyber components are being added to these systems. So what we're getting is now this complex mix of legacy systems and new technologies. And because of this, we now have numerous components or agents in these systems and even more interactions among all these components. And this gives rise to the ability for some of these interactions to be either unfamiliar, unplanned, or unexpected, or not visible or not immediately comprehensible by the people who design these systems in the first place. So the designers of a legacy system, for example, an old energy grid, may never have imagined that this grid would now be, quote, a smart grid. To compound these issues, we're constantly seeing software and hardware coming from third-party suppliers that are adding to this complex mix of different technologies coming together to build these kinds of systems. And furthermore, we see that our cyber attackers today are far more sophisticated and they have access to far more powerful tools than they ever did in the past. So this really fuels that cat and mouse game of cybersecurity. We need to constantly look at how we can harden our systems, make them more resilient in the face of cyber attacks, while cyber attackers themselves are becoming more and more powerful. So in this talk, we're going to be focused primarily on these unfamiliar, unplanned, or unexpected interactions. And these are what we call implicit interactions. So an implicit interaction is simply any interaction among the components of a system that are unfamiliar, unplanned, or unexpected, and really that were not intended to be part of the interactions that the system designers had in mind when they developed this system. So for lack of a better term, the way you can think about an implicit interaction throughout this talk is that it's really a backdoor. It's a vulnerability in the system that indicates some kind of unforeseen design flaw that allows for these interactions to exist. So what an implicit interaction does is it constitutes a linkage of which designers are generally unaware. And this, by definition, gives us a security vulnerability. So this means that there is a part of our system that we don't know how it behaves. And this is really due to the fact that the systems that we're building these days are so large and so complex that you just can't, as a human being, understand all of the possible ways in which all of the possible components can interact with each other. So the problem is, once you have these kind of interactions in your system, they then lay themselves out to be exploited by cyber attackers at later times. And what this means is that if one of these interactions is exploited, you can now have unexpected system behaviors that your system exhibits that you never thought were even possible. And one possible example of these kind of behaviors is that all of a sudden you may find that one of the components of your system, whether that's a software controlled component or whether it's a human actor in a process-based system, now has some unauthorized access to information. And this can compound into more and more problems. So what this work is trying to do is really address this issue. How do we identify and how do we analyze these implicit interactions so that we can avoid these kinds of security vulnerabilities? So the motivation for this work is the fact that assuring safety, security, and reliability of critical infrastructure systems is among the top priorities of any federal, local, state governments, owners and operators of critical infrastructures. And what we find is that there are shortcomings in the development of formal and rigorous approaches and tools for really determining whether these critical infrastructure systems are protected from cyber threats. So there's a real gap in the way that we are able to evaluate our systems to determine whether they're protected from cyber threats. And we find in the literature as well that there's really this ability to detect these kinds of undesirable interactions among our system components. So what we aim to do here is to develop a rigorous, and by rigorous I mean a formal methods-based approach, which is an approach based on mathematics, to better understand, identify, analyze, and mitigate these kinds of implicit interactions in critical infrastructure systems. So when I say now critical infrastructure systems, I mean any system that would be deemed critical. And we can look at this in the broadest possible sense. So we're not looking focused on one specific sector, but really any of these systems, these kinds of interactions may exist. So why do we want to take this formal methods, really mathematically rigorous approach? According to the DHS Cybersecurity Research Roadmap, there were a number of quotations that you can take out of this, really calling for this kind of research, this formal, rigorous, systematic engineering approach to addressing these kinds of cybersecurity issues. So for example, formal verification and analytical tools that are going to scale well are critical to building systems with high assurance. We find that theories are needed to support analytic tools and facilitate the prediction of trustworthiness. And this means modeling systems, simulating them, using formal methods to verify particular properties about them in terms of safety, security, and reliability. And what we really found out of this is that the Cybersecurity Research Roadmap, which was published in 2009, called for this kind of research, and yet we still don't have a large body of it. So it's really this area that's still ripe for progressing this field. So this is really why we're taking this formal methods-based approach. So our research goal with this project is really to develop an analysis framework that's going to enhance our understanding of how and why implicit interactions can exist in critical infrastructure systems. So why are these even possible? And then we want to identify any sort of system deficiencies in the critical components of these systems that give rise to implicit interactions to enable us to better assess any of the risks that would be taken by using such components to build these systems as a whole. So really what we're trying to do is come up with a way to identify why these implicit interactions can exist and what is the best ways in which we can try to avoid them as best as possible. So in doing so, we take a four-step approach here. So we start by modeling critical infrastructure systems using a mathematical framework. Then we formulate and identify the existence of implicit interactions. This is really the idea of identifying whether or not they exist in our system in the first place. And then once we find that some implicit interactions exist, we want to perform some analysis so that we can start to understand more about these kind of interactions, why they might exist, what could their potential impact be if we don't do anything about them, and all of these kinds of things. And lastly, we want to try to mitigate the existence or at least minimize the threat posed by implicit interactions if they're found to exist in our system. So moving forward through this talk, I'm going to go into each of these steps in a little bit of detail, discussing the technicalities associated with it. But before I do that, let's start with an illustrative example that will be really the vehicle with which I'll use to explain the technical details. So we'll look at a simple manufacturing cell. So a manufacturing cell, you might find this in any sort of assembly plant. When you look at a picture like this, there's a lot of moving parts going on. There's a lot of intangible software components as well that are controlling all of these robotics. So what we're going to do is we're going to simplify this picture a little bit. So now we start to look at this simplified version of a manufacturing cell. And what we want to do is identify what are the main critical components of this system. And we can really identify in this small case 4 main components. We have a storage agent, which would be representative of the conveyor belts and all of the sensors that control it, for example. We would have a handling agent, which would be a robotic arm that would move parts around this manufacturing cell. A processing agent, we might see this as a welding robot or something like this. And we have that intangible software or cyber component as well. That's really the conductor of the orchestra here that needs to coordinate all of these moving parts to ensure that this system is operating as efficiently as possible, for example. So when we try to design a system like this, we're going to come up with a way in which all of these components need to talk to each other in order to coordinate their actions to actually achieve something. So when doing this, you may come up with this kind of message passing diagram. And this really indicates to us the flow of information through this system that would allow a part to come down a conveyor belt, get moved to a processing station, get processed, get put back on the conveyor belt, and move on to the next phase of its manufacturing life cycle. So when we look at an image like this, we have our 4 agents that we identified. And here, we just have a number of messages that are being passed, and these are all indicated by a particular number, and that number is just indicating the sequence with which these messages would be passed around. So we're going to get some start event that happens outside of the boundary of our system. So this could be that the part is coming down a conveyor belt and it crosses some sensor, and this causes this particular part of the manufacturing cell to begin its operation. From there, the control agent will now send a load message to the storage agent saying, hey, we now have a part here, it's loaded. An acknowledgement might be sent back saying, okay, I see the part, and so on and so forth. And you can see this going on through this entire diagram. And if you follow the sequence of numbers, you follow the process that's desired. The solid lines here are explicit message passing communications, and the dashed lines represent communication in a shared environment. So in the context of a cyber controlled system, these would be environmental parameters that are either written to or read from some shared memory space amongst the cyber components that we have. So what we want to do is come up with a formal mathematical model of this system and its behavior. So this would represent the design system, the system that the designers intend to have. So how do we do this? How do we model the critical infrastructures using a mathematical framework? So the framework that we use is called Communicating Concurrent Cleany Algebra. So I'm going to give just a little taste of what the math is, but we're not going to go into a whole lot of detail about it. But what Communicating Concurrent Cleany Algebra is it's a formalism for modeling distributed multi-agent systems. And what it does is it captures both the communication and the concurrency of agents at an abstract algebraic level. And this provides a number of conveniences in terms of doing mathematical computations without needing to know all of the specific details of how the system operates. So the way we do this is that we express the influence of some external stimulus on agent behaviors in these kind of open systems, the ones that receive information from systems outside of their particular boundaries. And we can also have communication through shared environments. So again, the picture that I showed on a previous slide, we had the dashed lines for shared environments, and we had the solid lines representative of this influence of stimuli. So with this framework, we are given 3 levels of specification. So the first is really a stimulus response specification. It means that when an event happens in the system, what is the behavior of each of the agents in response to that event? So we specify this. The second is an abstract behavior specification. So what this means is that at an abstract level, we're describing what the behavior of each of the agents in our system is. And finally, we have a concrete behavior specification. So this means what is that agent actually doing? What is its real behavior? So I'll give this through some examples in a slide or two, but mathematically, a communicating concurrent Cleany algebra is a big mathematical system that looks like this. That's about as much as I want to say about it today. I can go into a whole bunch of detail about all the intricacies of the mathematics, but at this stage and for this presentation, I don't think it's strictly speaking important to know how this works, just that this is what we're doing to model the system. So once we have a specification, it looks a little bit something like this. So the stimulus response specification for strictly the control agent that we have ends up looking like a table like this, where we have 2 tables. The first here is representative of the next behavior of this agent in response to a stimulus, and the second table below is representative of the next stimulus that would be sent. So a response from an agent to a stimulus is a change in its behavior and a new stimulus that's passed out that would be propagated through the rest of the system so that other agents may respond to that stimulus, for example. And this is how that message passing communication is established. So really a table like this simply reads that when a load event happens, for example, well, let's pick one where the behavior actually changes. When a loaded event happens, which if you recall from the message passing diagram we had, is received by the control agent. If the control agent is in its idle state, it has just performed its idle behavior, it will now perform its preparation behavior, for example. And that's how you read these tables. And likewise, when that happens, the control agent will send a prepare message. And then any agent that will respond to the prepare message will do so, and that will happen in terms of a change in their behavior and the sending of another stimulus, for example. So at the abstract behavior specification, what we're doing here is simply describing the possible behaviors that an agent in our system could have. So looking at the control agent here, basically what we're saying is that at any given time, the control agent is either behaving according to its idle behavior, doing some preparation behavior, some initialization, or some processing. So this is representative of the different states that this agent could be in. Given the algebraic structure of communicating concurrent Cleany algebra, these terms can be much more complicated than what this is. We can have expressions of sequential composition, parallel composition, iterations, but for this simple example, we simply have this choice operator that says that at any given time, the behavior of the agent will be one of these possibilities. So taking this forward from this abstract behavior specification, we can then give that concrete behavior specification. So when I say that the control agent is behaving according to its idle behavior, what that actually means is that there's some state variable that it has that's being assigned, for example, the value 0. And that is representative of its idle behavior. So for example, if we look at the handling agent, you can have much more complicated behaviors that say that if whatever the status of the storage agent is, if the part has been loaded, then you can say that the material is ready to go, and you can represent that by 1, for example. And if it's not ready, then you say that the material is not ready for processing. And this is really just concretely what the behaviors mean in terms of their actual functionality. So the beauty of communicating concurrent and Cleany algebra is that with these 3 levels of specification, we can work at whichever level we need to in order to get the information that we need. So if we don't need to know all of this concrete behavior, we don't actually need this specification and we don't need to work with it. However, when we're dealing with implicit interactions, we actually need all 3 of these levels of specification, because the previous slide here provides us with how the agents can communicate using message passing communication, and the concrete behavior specification will show us how the agents can communicate using shared environments. And this will be done using definition and reference relationships between the shared variables in the shared memory space that each of these agents will have. So now that we have a mathematical model of our system, what we want to do is formulate and identify what it means for an implicit interaction to exist in this system. And the way we do that is we study the potential for communication among all the possible agents in the system. So we'll bring you back to this diagram here that really shows the designed behavior of our manufacturing cell. So what we're going to do is we're going to define a set P intended that's going to denote the set of intended system interactions. And how we're going to identify what the set of intended system interactions is we're going to use this diagram, and what we're going to do is unroll the sequences that are possible given the sequencing in the design. So when we unroll this diagram, basically this shows a control flow graph to where a message is being passed and how it's propagating through the system. So in this case, each instance of C, for example, the control agent, is in fact the same agent. It's just passing the control back and forth. So if you follow from the previous slide, you have 1 is the control agent, 2 goes to S, 3 goes back to C, and you'll see that this is the pattern that's happening through here. And what you find is that the dashed arrows, again, representative of the shared environment communication, allow you to sort of leapfrog some of the message passing communication, because that information is already available for that agent and they can access it at any time before they need to perform their behaviors. So what we do is we really try to identify all the possible paths through this tree here. And each possible path, where here we're saying the control agent via message passing sends something to S, and then by message passing again sends something back to C, we're following this path of the solid lines. And we do this for all possible paths through here. And this gives us that set of intended interactions. This is the set of interactions that as a system designer, we expect our system to exhibit. Anything outside of this set is something foreign to us as the designer, and then is indicative of a implicit interaction in the system. So let's look a little bit at how we formalize this. So again, it's a little bit of math, but I'm going to try to explain it in simple terms, so don't get caught up in the notation too much. So when we say that two agents have a potential for communication via stimuli, so via message passing, what we mean is that there exists 2 agents in the system where, for example, agent A will send a message to some agent B, B will send to C, C will send to D, and if D is the other agent that we're looking for, if we can make this chain of interaction, then we say that A has the potential to communicate with D through the intermediate agents B and C in that example. So really what we're trying to do is form these chains of interaction. And we can do the same sort of thing for shared environments. The difference is simply in the way that we define what it means for an agent to send a message to another agent. So that's not shown on the slide, but really when we take all of this together, an implicit interaction exists in our system if and only if for any 2 agents, A and B, where those are not the same agent, if there exists a potential for communication between A and B, which means that there exists this path, whether it's direct or indirect through intermediate agents, then any path in our intended set that's not a subpath will be implicit. So basically what this means is that any interaction that we can identify that is not a part of our intended interactions represents an implicit interaction in our system. So how do we actually compute this? So we formulated it in mathematics, but how do we actually do this? So we do this in two steps. The first is to determine the potential communication paths that exist from the system specification that we have. So this is using the system model that we have. We first make a communication graph that looks something like this down in the corner here. And what this does is it represents the ability for each of the agents in the system to communicate with one another. So on this diagram, solid lines represent the ability to directly communicate. So for example, you'll recall that the control agent could directly send a message to the storage agent. So we have this direct communication path. And the dashed lines represent indirect communication. So for example, the processing agent here can't directly send a message to the storage agent, but it can influence its behavior by sending messages through the intermediate agents, whether through C or through H in this case. So what we do is we have a small software tool that computes this communication graph and then starts issuing all of the possible paths between any pair of agents that we have. So if we look at agent P and agent S, it shows us that, yes, these two agents have the potential for communication, and then gives us all the possible ways through this graph by which you can have that communication. So in some cases, it'll be direct. In other cases, it'll be indirect. And we can do that for each and every pair of agents that we have. So once we've done that, we need to look at each of the possible communication paths that we have and check whether or not it's an implicit interaction. So as an example, we have two possible communication paths in our system. Let's look at the green one first. So the green one says that from H to S to C, all by message passing, this is a possible communication fragment in our system. So what we want to do is look, well, in our intended system interactions, is this something that we expect to see, this pattern here? And what we do is we find that, yes, that pattern exists right here. So H to S to C, all via message passing. And then what we find is we have a path that's possible in our system from P through C to S. And when we scan through our intended system interactions, we find that that pattern doesn't actually exist. We have P to C, but then nothing going to S. So this is now showing us that, wait a minute, this interaction is not something we expected to see. And now we can start to look at this interaction and say, well, why is this possible? So some of you might be saying, well, it's obvious. P communicates with C, and then C can eventually communicate with S. So we have this indirect communication. What's the problem? This seems to be perfectly possible in the system. Well, despite the fact that that is, in fact, the case, that there is this indirect communication, what the communication graph doesn't actually show you is that intended sequence of communication. The fact that despite that P can communicate with C and then S, the ability for that pattern of communication to exist was not something we explicitly designed into our system. Therefore, it's a foreign interaction. And we can imagine that if we're a cyber attacker and we can gain control of the processing agent P here, we can now use this interaction to send a message to the control agent that will cause something to happen at the storage agent. So we can see in a very simple example like this that we're able to perhaps tell the storage agent that the part isn't loaded on the conveyor belt when in fact it actually is, and we can halt the production this way. So this gives us the ability to now have some remote control in a certain sense of how this system behaves. So as the designer of this system, we do not want these kind of interactions to exist. But what we are finding is that there is a possibility that they do. So now that we know that they exist, what we want to do is analyze these implicit interactions. And we really want to start classifying and measuring their severity and their exploitability. So the idea is, if this exists in our system, how bad is it? And how likely is it going to be that a cyber attacker will be able to actually do something that is potentially going to have a negative impact on the operation of the system? So in doing this, this provides us this way of measuring this potentially negative impact on our system. And we do this in two ways. The first is we have a measure of severity. And without going into all the formal mathematics about it, severity is really just a measure of the relative non-overlap between a possible interaction and the intended interactions in the system. And what the severity tells us is that if we have less overlap, that means that the severity will be higher, which means that the interaction that's in question is really more unexpected in the system. It's really something that we did not see coming at all. And what this tells us is that there's a lot more going on under the hood of our system than we maybe initially thought. So this now gives us a way to start ranking these implicit interactions in terms of which ones might be the most unexpected and the ones that we might want to deal with first. Similar to this, we also calculate a measure of exploitability. And what this measurement is it's measuring the particular fraction of the ways that a source agent, so in our case, a source agent is the agent from which an interaction originates, and looking at how that agent can possibly influence the behavior of all of the adjacent agents in this chain that we have to eventually influence the behavior of the sync agent. So what this means is that we're really trying to determine whether the source agent can do just about anything at all and cause some potential change in behavior of the sync, or whether it really needs to wait for that quote perfect storm of conditions to happen before it's able to actually do something. So what we have here is that if you have a higher measure of exploitability, it means that if you can gain control of the source agent of an implicit interaction, you have much more flexibility in the ways that you are going to be able to influence the behaviors of everybody down the chain of the interaction, eventually influencing the behavior of the sync agent. So I mentioned before, we have a prototype software tool that does all of this computation for us. So for the given manufacturing cell, this is just a sample of the tool output. So it's giving us all the possible paths, for example, between agent S and agent C, and it's starting now to compute the severity. So this means that, for example, we have a severity of 0.5. So what this means is that this interaction here is in fact an implicit interaction, and it's shown down here as it pulls out all of these paths. And what it means is that this interaction has two communications in it. There's one by shared environments and one by message passing. And what this means is that half of this interaction is something we didn't expect to see. So for example, we may expect that S communicates with H via shared environments, but then this message passing communication is something completely foreign to us. And that's how the severity gets computed. So the longer these implicit interactions end up being, the actual severity ends up decreasing, because what you end up doing is having to rely on this very long chain of conditions to be satisfied in order to make this interaction exist in a form that's so vastly unexpected. On this side, we're now looking at the exploitability of each of the implicit interactions that we found. So in this case, what we're doing is we're trying to identify what are all the possible things that agent S can do that's going to influence the behavior of agent H that will then cause H to influence the behavior of the control agent. And in this case, we're computing the actual attack scenarios. And what this tells us is the precise things that agent S needs to do in order to cause that chain reaction, so to speak. And here, the exploitability is computed as 1. So what this means is that this is a maximally exploitable implicit interaction. It means that S can do anything in its power according to this communication, so via shared environment. So its only behavior is to modify the status variable. And if it does so, then the control agent's going to be impacted. So this means that agent S has all the power. If we look down at a different example, for instance, we're now looking at a longer path. And what this means is that out of all of the possible ways that agent S can behave, it has only this one possible behavior that's going to cascade through this entire chain of interactions that will eventually cause the sync agent to change its behavior, which means that that's the only possible way in which agent S can have an impact on the system behavior. So we do find that there are some cases where the exploitability is 0. And what this means is that there is in fact no way that if you gain control of agent H in this example, that you can influence the behavior of agent S outside of the very trivial ways. For example, telling the entire system to shut down, which are the kind of things that are trivial because they're very easy to detect when that's happening when it shouldn't be happening. So out of this entire example of the manufacturing cell, we find, after using our tool to run the experimental results, that 29 of the 65 total possible interactions in the system are in fact implicit interactions. And the reason that these can exist is that there's this possibility for out-of-sequence messages or reads and writes to shared variables from the system agents. And some possible explanations for why that might be possible is if you have a cyber attack, for example, where one of the agents goes rogue and starts sending messages out of sequence, or you could have a natural failure in your system, which means that it could just be malfunctioning and causing these out-of-sequence messages to happen. And we need to actually accommodate for both, because both end up being these still this security vulnerability. It still gives that rise to that unexpected system behavior that could lead us vulnerable. So what this does is it demonstrates that there's a lot of hidden complexity and coupling amongst all the agents in your system. And that gives you that potential for unexpected system behaviors. So that's what we want to take care of with this work, is to mitigate the amount of unexpected system behaviors that you have so that you can really predict how reliable your system's going to be. So when something happens, you know what its response is going to be. And that will give us a way to avoid a lot of the issues that can come out of these. So I'll mention too at this stage, because we're presenting the experimental results for this very simple manufacturing cell system, but this kind of communication and dependencies amongst the agents are found in just about every complex distributed system. So again, whether that's a software-dependent cyber-physical system controlled by some cyber components with physical components, whether it's actually a process that exists within an organization where you have all of the agents actually as human actors that behave in very deterministic ways, given a certain context, all of this framework will apply to those kind of systems. So the last thing we want to do is, now that we've identified that these implicit interactions exist, and we know that some of them are obviously more severe or more exploitable than others, how can we start to mitigate the existence of, or at least minimize the threat posed by these implicit interactions? And this comes in the form of preemptive solutions and reactive solutions. So for preemptive approaches, what we really strive to do is eliminate the potential for communication between two agents that may have an implicit interaction between them, but still the catch is that we want to maintain the overall system functionality. So while it's very easy to say, well, we'll just not have any of our components talk to each other, while that will solve the problem of implicit interactions, it will also make your system completely useless. So some of the ways in which you can do this is to introduce intermediate agents in the communication that decouple the communication between these two infracting agents, or you can look at modifying the behaviors of these agents so that that communication doesn't exist in the same form anymore. Often you can't do that without negatively impacting the actual functionality of the system. So in those cases, what we want to do is install reactive approaches where we're monitoring the communication and the behavior of particular agents in the system to find suspicious activity. And using the analysis that we had where we're analyzing the severity and the exploitability, this allows us to not have to monitor all of the communication in the system or all of the behavior of every agent that we have, but instead allows us to focus on particular agents that may be problematic, for example. So as a result of all of this research, what we're really gaining is an enhanced understanding of this hidden complexity and coupling in these large, complex critical infrastructure systems. And this provides us a formal foundation upon which these mitigation approaches can be developed. So the mitigation approaches are still a work in progress, how to actually deal with these in a way that's going to be suitable. But what we have with the framework that I've presented is really this formal foundation that allows us to make decisions on how to mitigate potential implicit interactions using a very systematic and mathematically rigorous approach. And this gives us the basis for developing guidelines in the future for designing and implementing these kinds of critical infrastructure systems that are going to be resilient to cyber threats in the first place. So if we find that there's a particular pattern that exists when we're developing a system that allows for implicit interactions, then we can start to look at how can we avoid that particular pattern to eliminate that possibility of implicit interactions exhibiting themselves in the systems that we build. And while there's still a lot more to be done with all of this, right? So I've been mentioning that the mitigation approaches is something we want to do, but there's a lot more to it as well. So what we can do is we can look at refining the classification and measurement of severity and exploitability, and we can add to that by studying the impact of implicit interactions through simulation. So to this point, when we do the exploitability computations, we're also computing the attack scenarios. And what that is, again, is the ways in which the source of the implicit interaction can eventually cause some influence at the sink of the interaction. And what we want to do is now study what exactly does that mean? What does it mean to influence the sink behavior? And does that behavior give rise to a very critical consequence? Or is it something that's really not so bad? So something along the lines of, if you find an implicit interaction in a nuclear command and control system, if I exploit an implicit interaction, am I going to cause a light on a control panel to blink on and off, or am I going to cause a complete nuclear meltdown? And knowing the difference between these two things is very important for us moving forward for really prioritizing how to deal with these vulnerabilities. Obviously, we have a lot of room to further articulate the mitigation approaches that we can have. And our current work is really looking at validating and evaluating these approaches in real-world applications. So the manufacturing cell that was presented in this talk so far is a lab system, one that's cooked up, small enough to really illustrate the ideas, but really isn't too reflective of an overall real-world application. So we're working with the US Transportation Command on analyzing an actual case study system that they've provided to us. And this is allowing us to obtain a lot of useful direction and feedback that can be helpful in transitioning our foundational research into practical outcomes from this project. So this work is ongoing right now. There's also room for us to develop our software tools to help automate the specification, identification, and analysis of these critical infrastructure systems based on the mathematical foundations that we've developed. So right now, our software tool is in its prototype phase. It does the job for getting these simple examples done, but we really want to push this forward and develop a tool that can be deployed to owners, operators, governments, whomever that may want to analyze their systems on their own, and really make this available to them. And that's something that we're looking forward to doing in the next short while with this project. So to give a few concluding remarks, I discussed the implicit interactions and how they can pose a serious cyber threat to critical infrastructure systems. And really this comes down to the ability for cyber attackers to exploit these interactions in such a way that they now have the ability to cause our systems to behave in unexpected ways. And what those unexpected ways are can really vary depending on how these interactions manifest themselves in the systems. So the work that we're doing is really aiding in addressing these potential security vulnerabilities, and it's targeting early stages of system development. So a lot of what I've discussed is happening at a design and specification phase of these systems. That's the ideal way in which this framework would be applied so that you can identify and mitigate these vulnerabilities before deploying your system. That being said, it's also very obvious that a lot of critical infrastructure systems aren't designed from scratch anymore, and it's really this mix of the legacy systems and the new technologies. So what we're looking at is how we can reverse engineer the behavior of these existing systems to adapt them to our model and still run this analysis in order to identify these kind of vulnerabilities. And really what's important out of all of this is that this analysis framework is providing a lot of information that can help to drive decisions on where and how to spend the increasingly valuable resources that we have in terms of time, cost, etc., and focusing our mitigation efforts on addressing the security vulnerabilities that are going to be most impactful. So for example, we may not be able to achieve 100% security, but at least we can start to focus our efforts on eliminating the vulnerabilities that are going to result in the most critical of consequences. So that's really where this the framework is helping us along. And the last point I want to make is that community engagement, so our work with US Transcom, for example, is starting to reach out, and it's enabling us to make better contributions to these emerging challenges in critical infrastructure cybersecurity. And I think this is one of the mandates of CIRI, for example, is really pushing towards this. And we're starting to see, at least in this project, that we're able to start making these contributions. And I think it's very important to keep this community engagement up as we move forward. So just to close off, we have a number of publications, whether published or under review, related to all of the work that I've presented to you. So if you're interested, by all means, most of them are available online. You can also contact me and I can send you a copy of the paper if you're interested. Additionally, there's a few related references, more about the algebraic framework that we use, and supporting references for the motivation for our work, for example. So I think that's just about it. I don't know, Randy, is there a way to handle some questions here? I'd be happy to take some if there are any questions.
Sure, we have a few minutes.
Sure.
Anyone have any questions? Take yourself off of mute and ask away. Well, apparently not.
I guess not, yeah.
Okay.
Well, I'll thank everyone for their attention and for joining us for this webinar, and I wish you all a great day. Randy, if you want to close us out.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Jason. Really appreciate it. It was a great talk. Again, thanks everyone for your attendance. Really appreciate it. The next CIRI webinar series talk will be on February 27th at 3 p.m. in Central Time. And that will be Major General Richard Hayes, who is the Adjutant General of the state of Illinois, who will be talking about the new mission that has been given to the National Guard. It's a cybersecurity mission, and it's really fascinating. And so please join us for that on February 27th at 3 p.m. And for your information, the webinar today has been recorded, and we will be posting it and the slide deck on the CIRI website. So if there's nothing else, that concludes our webinar for the day. Thanks, everyone.